Good afternoon. This is Donald Denoon giving a summary of a talk that I gave a couple of years ago to the Piedmont History Group on the role of Gough Whitlam as Prime Minister and before that in the independence of Papua New Guinea, which occurred in 1975. I should explain that I lived through many of these events in Papua New Guinea and have quite vivid memories of what it meant and how people responded to it. 30 or 40 years later, I'm surprised to find in Australia that impressions are very different, that it is commonly believed, for example, that Papua New Guinea became independent much too soon and would have benefited from at least some decades more of Australian administration, and that perhaps Papua New Guinea should not be independent at all. It's also widely assumed that the person responsible for the accelerated rate of Papua New Guinea's independence was Edward Gough Whitlam, Prime Minister from 1972 to 75, and it's these set of assumptions that I wish to examine this afternoon. If, to start with, we look at a map of Papua New Guinea now, some interesting changes have happened as a consequence of independence itself. Papua New Guinea is often represented, as it is here, as a freestanding country, a single country, with only one neighbour, namely Indonesia, and Australia is really not on the map at all. Until 1975, Papua New Guinea was in many ways an extension of Australia. It was a set of two territories of the Australian Federation, and it was two. Papua and New Guinea had a quite distinct status in international law. Until 1975, it made no sense to see Papua New Guinea as a place separate from Australia. In fact, the capital, Port Moresby, has its only advantage is that it is easily accessed from Australia. It's almost inaccessible from the rest of the country of which it is the capital. So perceptions change with independence, but for other reasons as well. Australians had been involved directly in Papua since the turn of the 20th century, when Papua became a territory of Australia, analogous to the Northern Territory or the Australian Capital Territory, equally bound up in the Australian Federation. And New Guinea, having previously been a German colony until the First World War, was a mandated territory, ultimately with the responsibility of the League of Nations and in the United Nations, and Australia was the mandated territory, the mandated authority for that territory. They were, in fact, administered as if they were one enterprise, especially after the Second World War, when there was a single uniform administration. In the 1960s, when United Nations Trusteeship Council turned up for an inspection of New Guinea, but not of Papua, I met an unfortunate economic statistician whose job it was to take the Papua New Guinea GNP and statistics generally, cut them in half and attribute half to Papua and half to New Guinea. It was an entirely arbitrary exercise at that point. Until the 1960s, certainly, there was a widespread assumption that it would be at least some generations and possibly centuries before Papua or New Guinea became a separate entity in international law, if indeed it ever became so at all. Things changed rapidly in the 1960s and from then onwards. Having set the scene, I would like to address this issue through the lives of several leading players and one person whose not a leading player, but whose experience was emblematic of the whole relationship. I'd like to begin with Paul Hasluck, a brilliant scholar, a man of great integrity, and a West Australian politician. One of the few Australians who ever became a companion of honour in the Queen's gift. He became Minister for Territories in the Menzies government and was Minister for Territories for more than 10 years. He wasn't just minister, he thought of himself as the Inspector General, as effectively the boss of the whole Papua New Guinea administration, for which he was very well equipped. He was a serious scholar and a historian, as well as a very good writer, but he had also been involved in Western Australia in discussing the issue of the future of Indigenous people in Australia. Essentially, he was the creator of the assimilation policy which prevailed throughout Australia in the 1950s, whereby the purpose was to what was thought of as levelling up, to take Aboriginal people away from their environment as much as possible, turn them into brown-skinned Europeans with, therefore, all the rights and privileges and opportunities of white Australians. This was not a malicious idea at the time, and it's only in retrospect that we can see that this was pretty close to genocide as a theory. So he brought that approach to the management of the Northern Territory and Papua New Guinea and the Australian Capital Territory, though that wasn't much of a job for him at that point. It's interesting that in the Northern Territory, it was Hasluck who was responsible for the removal of Aboriginal children from their families on a very large scale, accommodating them in special schools where they would be taught basically how to behave as working class white Australians. Because the Northern Territory had such a large proportion of the Indigenous population in Australia, the other states tended to follow Paul Hasluck's example. He was a very persuasive man and had a great deal of authority, and it was much easier for state premiers to decide, we'll do what Paul Hasluck does, he must know what he's doing, rather than to devise an alternate policy for the promotion of the prospects of Indigenous people. His approach in Papua New Guinea was actually, at first sight, the reverse of that, which was not to try to break up the Papuan and New Guinean communities, to promote the strength of village communities, and in a very limited way transform people's lives gradually and uniformly. Paul Hasluck had a fear of, which he derived, I suppose, from observing what happened in independent Africa, had a fear of elites grasping power from the departing colonial British and French and misusing that power to create personal wealth and personal power bases for themselves. In order to prevent the emergence of an elite, he wanted uniform development, that is to say, widespread primary education of a very limited kind, but a very widespread kind. This policy prevailed until the end of his term as a Minister for Territories, when Menzies retired and Harold Holt drowned, or possibly went to China. There was a struggle within the Liberal Party for the leadership. Paul Hasluck, being a very self-aware and self-conscious man, and not wishing to push himself, realized that he was the obvious person to take over. He'd run Papua New Guinea, so he could obviously run Australia very easily and very smoothly. So he didn't bother to canvass for the job of Prime Minister, and therefore John Grey Gorton snuck in and became Prime Minister ahead of him. And in order to deal with the problem of Paul Hasluck, he promoted him to Minister for Defence. That was the end of Paul Hasluck's term as administrator of Papua New Guinea. As minister in charge of Papua New Guinea. A period in which no decision was to be made for the Papua New Guinea's future, because Hasluck, like many other Australians, was persuaded that no such decision would be needed for maybe several more decades. And why would you rush into a decision when it was unnecessary to make it in the first place? That was Paul Hasluck. The next person I would like to discuss is a young woman called Tessie Lavau, a Papuan who came from a village very close to Port Moresby, and at the time we're talking about had some primary education and was very self-aware and self-improving, and had become a nursemaid to an Australian policeman's family. Unusually, the Australian policeman's family got on very well with Tessie Lavau, so much so that when they took their children for a holiday in Australia, they took Tessie Lavau with them as basically a nursemaid. A few years later, the policeman and his wife decided they had had enough of living in Papua New Guinea and retired to live in Australia. But they parted from Tessie Lavau in very good terms and promised that if ever she decided she would like to visit Australia, they would be only too happy to accommodate her, to arrange her accommodation and feeding and so on, and show her around. Tessie Lavau thought about that for a while, and a couple of years later she did decide she wanted to visit Australia. This was an astonishing decision to make, because it set all kinds of precedents. The White Australia policy prevailed at that time, whose burden was essentially to keep all brown people, and especially all Melanesians, out of Australia as far as possible. Tessie Lavau, as a resident of Papua and of Papua New Guinea, was not a citizen of Australia, therefore she could not have a passport. Before Tessie was allowed to travel to her good friends in Australia for a holiday, her application had to be approved by the patrol officer of her village, the district commissioner of her district, the administrator of Papua and Papua New Guinea, the police force, to make sure she was a person of good character, and the people that she was going to stay with in Australia had to survive a police check to make sure that they were people of the highest possible integrity. In order for that to happen, her application had to be approved by the Minister for Territories, the Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, the Minister for the Interior, so several ministers, a couple of administrators. I mean, her file of application is very thick indeed. Eventually she was allowed to travel and became, so far as I know, the first Papua New Guinean tourist ever to visit Australia, and that was in the 1950s. This tells you a lot about the nature of the relationship between the two populations and the two territories and the two incipient nations. And that's why I think Tessie Lavau is a profoundly significant, if only symbolic, figure in the story of Papua New Guinea's independence. When Paul Hasluck ceased to be Minister for Territories, who was going to succeed him? It turned out that the Country Party wanted that portfolio. Quite why they wanted it, I don't know, because they certainly had no particular interest in Papua New Guinea. It was suggested that they wanted to make sure that Papua New Guinea didn't start growing sugar, because that would have competed with Queensland sugar. Who knows? But in any case, the National Party wanted that portfolio, and they promoted a man called Charles Barnes to be the successor to Hasluck as Minister for Territories. Charles Barnes was an interesting man in that he was a horse breeder. He bred, in fact, a horse that was widely thought to have been pulled in order not to win the Melbourne Cup. A very distinguished Queensland horse breeder, but very limited in his conversations. Essentially, he could talk about horses, which when he went to Papua New Guinea was a bit of a problem because nobody had actually seen a horse. So he did not get on particularly, he didn't get on badly, but he didn't get on particularly well with Papua New Guineans. He'd also had the interesting experience of having a farm expropriated in order to create a mine, and he'd benefited hugely from the expropriation. So when a mine was mooted for Bougainville during his reign, he was delighted. He thought Bougainvillians ought to be delighted with the possibility of having a world-class hole in the ground in the middle of their territory. Charles Barnes had no particular idea at all, really, so far as we know, about the future of Papua New Guinea. However, his hand was forced by an interesting intervention. In 1964, a man called John Guise, the most eminent Papua New Guinean of his generation, half-caste, a policeman who had risen to the rank of sergeant and had led a Papua New Guinean delegation to the Queen's coronation. He had also become a member of the Advisory Council, the Legislative Council of Papua New Guinea, which advised the administrator, who often ignored their advice, but at least they did advise the administrator on the future of Papua New Guinea. It was a mainly white body with very few indigenous people, but also had John Guise, who, through sheer force of character, rose to be a significant figure in that body. In 1964, John Guise led a delegation of the Papua New Guinea Legislative Council to Canberra to ask a significant question of the Australian government. Was it possible, they wanted to know, that Papua New Guinea could become the seventh state of the Australian Federation? Nobody had actually ruled that out, although nobody had explicitly argued that it should happen, except a few missionaries. So it was a valid question that did need to be resolved. Perhaps not resolved in such a hurry, but it did need to be resolved. Charles Barnes had no idea. He was pretty sure this was a bad idea, but he didn't know quite how to handle it. So he referred it to Cabinet. Cabinet was thoroughly alarmed at the possibility of several million Melanesians becoming full Australian citizens with all the rights and entitlements that would involve, including free range through Australia, free access to schools, hospitals, so on and so forth. So Cabinet gave Charles Barnes very strict instructions. No, he said, tell the Papua Guinean delegation they can never become an Australian state. Their future, though perhaps long in the future, their future is to be independent of Australia altogether. And that was a message that was taken back to John Guise and his delegation, and that was a message that he took back to Papua New Guinea. So Charles Barnes, who had a very low opinion of brown people in general, was the minister who made it essential, or who made it inevitable, perhaps it had always been inevitable, but who made the declaration that mattered, that the future of Papua New Guinea was as an independent, separate country and not as an appendage of Australia. John Guise is also famous for promoting the possibility of Papua New Guinea having its own economy. In order to do that, it needed a source of revenue, and there pretty much wasn't one until copper and gold were discovered in Bougainville on a very large scale, and the Bougainville mine at Panguna began to be developed, which would eventually be a huge money spinner, mainly for Papua New Guinea in general, rather than for Bougainville in particular. So, by encouraging the development of the Bougainville mine, Charles Barnes not only promoted Papua New Guinea's independence, but also lit the fuse for Bougainville's secession and civil war. We got to the end of Charles Barnes' reign at the beginning of 1972, when John Gorton was overthrown and McMahon became Prime Minister and appointed Andrew Peacock, an ambitious young Liberal from Melbourne, as Minister for Territories, basically to keep him out of the country. Andrew Peacock was ambitious and charming and thoughtful and smart. As soon as he was appointed Minister for Territories, he jumped on an airplane to go and look at the territory of which he was for which he was responsible. And he met all the leading Papuans and New Guineans of the day and partied with them. Andrew Peacock was the first Australian that Papua New Guineans ever met, the first Australian of any authority, who behaved like a human being, who went out and got drunk with them, who went out to parties with them, and who managed to persuade them that the idea of Papua New Guinea's independence wasn't simply something on paper. It was something which could actually happen and wouldn't be a bad idea anyway. Andrew Peacock was only minister for less than 12 months. He passed no legislation. There was no time for that. It's hard to point to any particular thing that he did, but he changed the mood in Papua New Guinea and to an extent in Australia, and made the possibility of Papua New Guinea's independence a realistic and attractive one for many Papua New Guineans who had hitherto feared being cut off from the source of all their money and education and health and so on services. By the end of 1972, when Gough Whitlam came to power, therefore, Andrew Peacock had set the mood in a decisive way and made everything that followed after that possible. Now we turn to Gough Whitlam, an interesting and complex man. He's not getting any easier to understand with the passage of time, but one important key to the way that he saw the world was it was time for Australia to be a fully independent country. That meant he was suspicious of the international treaties that bound Australia to America, but didn't bind America to Australia, to the United Kingdom, and so on. He was deeply suspicious of Australia's role as a colonial power at a time when every other colonial power had decolonised. Here was Australia stuck in the sort of 19th century model of colonial administration when everybody else had moved on by several generations. He succeeded in abolishing imperial honours so that Australians stopped struggling to be called Sir and Lady, at least for a while. He abolished the appeal of all cases from the Australian High Court to the Privy Council of the House of Lords, So in many ways, he was determined that Australia would become an independent country, and that meant that he would sever the ties binding it to the outside world, including the ties that bound it to Papua New Guinea. He was in a hurry. He was also, there were reasons for his hurry as well. By 1972, there were all kinds of things going on in Papua New Guinea that had not been planned or intended or even noticed by Charles Barnes or Havelock indeed. One was in the Rabaul area in East New Britain. During the German period, Germans had moved in with a lot of pieces of paper and got the local people to put crosses on those pieces of paper, which said the Germans, entitled the Germans to freehold ownership of much of the very prosperous and fertile land around Rabaul. 50 years later, the indigenous people were really pissed off with this arrangement and were demanding a renegotiation of this arrangement, which their grandfathers had not understood at the time, and which they thought was burdensome and cheaty and dishonest and ought to be overthrown. And they contrived to take a case to the Australian High Court, which unfortunately found in favour of the Australians who had inherited the land from the Germans who had got indigenous people to put crosses on the pieces of paper. They found in favour of, in other words, the white settlers, and against the indigenous people who believed, indeed knew, that this was really their land and it ought to be handed over to them. So there was a great deal of fuss and violence in that Rabaul area, including fights in which the district commissioner, an Australian called Jack Emanuel, was assassinated. So there was that. Matters were so dangerous in Rabaul that when Prime Minister John Gorton went to address a crowd in Rabaul, he was advised to carry sidearms to protect himself from the crowd. So a situation in which an Australian Prime Minister had to carry arms in order to travel through Papua New Guinea was clearly unsatisfactory. Some people living in Papua, which, if you remember, was an Australian territory like the Northern Territory, like the ACT. Some people, led by Josephine Abijah, a charismatic sort of Joan of Arc character, were trying to organise themselves to demand separation from New Guinea, which they thought of as full of uncivilised people, and full membership of the Australian Federation as Australian citizens. This was quite a credible argument. I mean, after all, people living in the Northern Territory were Australian citizens already, whether they became a state or not. And they were planning, so Gough Whitlam believed, a case to take to the High Court of Australia to demand recognition of their rights as Australian citizens. Now you can imagine that 1 million or more Papuans becoming Australian citizens and forcing the transformation of the Australian social services, education, constitution and so on was a fairly alarming prospect. And Gough Whitlam, that was one of the factors which determined Gough Whitlam to move as fast as possible towards Papua New Guinea's independence. There were other reasons as well. There was trouble on the Indonesian side of the border. The indigenous people on the Indonesian side of the border were just as unhappy with Indonesian rule as you would expect them to be. They resented the fact that they were treated as uncivilized savages just because they were not Muslims, and they tended to organize themselves either to appeal to the United Nations or for warfare against the military occupation of their territory. There was a prospect, in other words, of significant warfare breaking out on Papua New Guinea's border, which would inevitably involve Australian forces trying to patrol the border, which was an invisible line, in fact, most of the territory. Those were the predicaments that Gough Whitlam faced. So he and his Minister for Territories, a man called Morrison, but not related to the current one, wanted to move as fast as possible towards independence. The obstacle to swift independence was that a new generation of Papua New Guineans had formed, had been elected to a legislative council, and were organising a survey, a constitutional planning committee, to decide what sort of constitution Papua New Guinea should have. And they were, the first draft of the constitution they wrote was actually longer than the Indian constitution, which is to say huge. And it was looking as if these negotiations as to an agreement about what Papua New Guinea should look like constitutionally might go on for decades, during which Australia would be in a very vulnerable position. So Gough Whitlam was in a hurry to carry out the foreordained policy, the policy that had already been settled, although not talked about, of Papua New Guinea becoming independent. Why it had not been talked about was that the coalition government before Whitlam was rather embarrassed at having insisted on Papua New Guinea becoming independent, and they really didn't want anybody talking about it, and they still held Hasluck's view that they could wait several decades before any decision was finally made. So Gough Whitlam certainly did push. He pushed a bit faster than the nationalist movement in Papua New Guinea was comfortable with. And that is why he got to, the country became independent in 1975, when it might have taken a bit longer. The particular trigger was, if they didn't become independent by 1975, there would have to be a general election in Papua New Guinea, and it was not clear what on earth would happen then. Highlanders might refuse to go along with independence. New Guineans and Papuans were often at daggers drawn, and there were riots in Port Moresby between people from Papua and people from New Guinea. The situation in Rabaul, where the land was an issue, was not going to be resolved. More and more people in Papua were likely to be persuaded that they'd be better off as Australian citizens than as a minority in a New Guinea-dominated independent country. So to cut a long story short, Gough Whitlam certainly promoted independence, but it had already been decided 10 years earlier by Cabinet and authorised and announced by Charles Barnes, and it had been hastened along and the path smoothed by Andrew Peacock in his brief term as Minister for Territories. So in brief, I think it was inevitable that Papua New Guinea would become independent. There was never any real risk of it becoming a seventh Australian state. It would have to do that despite the wishes of the Australian government at all times. And Whitlam's role was, when people accused Gough Whitlam of promoting Papua New Guinea independence against the wishes of the majority of Australian people, he was such an arrogant man that he was delighted to be held responsible for something that he knew the whole Australian government and the whole Australian population had favoured in the first place. Thank you.